Hello guys, this is Tafazgwa from StackDev and welcome to my YouTube course. In this course, you are going to learn how to create a full stack application using Springboot and reactjs. So this course I've divided into 3 sections. The first section, you are going to learn how to create a RESTful API with Springboot. And you're also going to learn how to integrate your reactjs app with Springboot and be able to save your front-end application with Springboot on its default port 8080. Then in the last section, you're going to learn how to create cleaner, efficient code with React hooks and functional programming. So in the first section, you're going to learn how to create CRUD functionality of a RESTful API. That is, you're going to learn about data persistence through creating, reading, updating, and deleting data. Then you're also going to learn how to run your JPA unit testing. Then in the second section, you're going to learn how you can actually go ahead and configure Webpack and as well as Babel. Then lastly, in the last section, you're going to learn about Axios, which is a promise-based HTTP client. And you're also going to learn about React functional programming through React hooks. Then lastly, you're going to learn how you can actually go ahead and create your unit testing using JEST test runner. Stay tuned. All right, so just quickly go to start.spring.io. You'll find your Spring initializer. So this is where we are going to initialize our Spring Boot web application. So for the project, I'm going to leave as Marvin. For the language, Java. Then for the Spring Boot version, I'm going to leave the default. So under the company group, you can actually go ahead and put your company name. So I'm simply going to say the name of the channel, StackDev, and my nickname. Then for the ID, I'm simply going to say to name it Springboot reactjs Fullstack, like this. Then for the description, I'm simply going to say full stack application using Springboot and reactjs. Then for the package name, it automatically put it for you. Then for the packaging, I'm simply going to leave jar, and then for the Java version, I'm simply going ahead to choose Java 8. So the next thing that you need to do after you have initialized your configurations like so is to actually go ahead and add your dependencies. So for the dependencies, I'm simply going to add the JPA that is used to persist data in our SQL. Then the next dependency that I'm going to use is TimeLeaf, which is actually a template engine that we're going to use for Spring Boot. Then also, I'm also going to add web, which is going to allow us to create our RESTful API. So it will give us the MVC, that is model view controller pattern. Then also for the database, I'm simply going to add H2, which is an in-memory database for Spring Boot. And also the other dependency that I need to add is Lombok, which is actually a Java annotation library, which helps us in reducing boilerplate of code. So once you have added these dependencies, the next thing that you actually need to do is to click on generate. So once you've clicked on generate, it will create a zipped folder for your project. So once it has created a zipped folder for your project, just quickly go ahead and unzip it and open the project with your favorite IDE. So in this case, I'm simply going to open my project with IntelliJ. So let's simply go ahead to IntelliJ. So right now, as you can see, after you have unzipped your project and download the dependencies on your IDE, you should have a folder structure similar to this one. So in this folder structure, I'm simply going to go under source, then under main, under Java, and then under this package name. So under the com.stackdev, under this ID package, this is where we need to put all our code in. So we are going to build our application in this package name, that is the REST API. So what we're going to build is simply going to be a REST API, which is going to be a user registration REST API. So for that, the first thing that I need to do is I need to create a package called models, where I'm actually going to put all my models in. So just quickly go ahead and right click, right? So I'll right click, then I'll create a package. Then this package name, I'm simply going to call it models. So once you have created the package name models, in this package, I'm going to create a class called user, right? So all right, so right now I've created a class called user. So inside this class, this is where I am going to tell my Spring that for the table that we're going to use, can actually go ahead and define the data and the attributes that we want to use in this model. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to annotate your model class with its entity. So what this entity does is it actually tells Spring that this is going to be a JPA entity that is going to be used to create a table called user. So so right now I'm simply telling my Spring that, okay, for this entity I'm going to create a table called user. So the next thing that I need to do is to actually go ahead and import the class from the Javascript.persistence. So after I've created the table user, the next thing that you need to do is to create the fields. So for the fields that I'm going to create, I'm going to create the fields. The first one is going to be an ID. That is going to be our primary key. So I'm simply going to say ID, right? And then the next thing that I need, the next field that I need to have is going to be the name. So these are the attributes that I'm going to that are going to be used to store my data. So for my user registration, I need the name. Then I also need the surname. So I will declare my instance variables here, surname. Then the next thing that I need is I need the email, right? So after the email, the next thing that I need the username. The username, right? So it's a string. Then lastly, I need the password, right? So this is simply going to create a table called user with these fields. So the next thing that you need to do is you need to tell your Spring which primary key that you are going to have. So in this case, I'm simply going to say ID. That is going to act as my primary key. Then I need to put an annotation called a generated value. Because what happens is as we continuously going to persist data in this table called user, we actually need to tell Spring to actually go ahead and automatically increment the ID. So for instance, if the ID starts at 1, we want it to actually go ahead and auto increment to 2. The next thing we add another user, it auto increment to 3, and so forth. So once you have done this, the next thing that you actually need is to create your constructor, that is your default and your non-default constructor. So remember, we had included a dependency called Lombok, which is a developer's tool that allows us to create code with less boilerplate. So I'm not actually going to create the default and the non-default constructor, but what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to use an annotation for that, for my default and non-default constructor. So the annotations that I need is, at first I need the OArgs constructor. So what this annotation does is it actually create your non-default constructor. Then the next annotation that I need is the no args constructor. So what this annotation does is it will actually make the non-default constructor available the default constructor available as well. So the no args is for the default, and then this is for the non-default constructor. So once I have my constructors, the next thing I need is my access modifiers. That is, I need my my get and my set methods. So Lombok again, it comes with that utility, so that you can actually go ahead and create your access modifiers. So for my access modifiers, the first thing that I need to bring in is I need to bring in my data. My data annotation. So what this annotation does is it actually go ahead and brings in our access modifiers, that is the getter and the setters. So for all these fields that I have, by just annotating it with its data, we're actually telling Spring to actually go ahead and include the getters and the setter methods for all these instance variables that we've created. So once you have done that, I think we are probably done with the constructor. So just know that a data brings it the access modifiers, and as well as you know, like the toStrings method and so forth, but we are not going to worry about that. So the next thing after you've created this class is we now actually want to go ahead and create our repository. So in that root folder of our project, of this package, just quickly go ahead and create another package. So this package, I'm going to call it controllers, right? Sorry, not controllers. Okay, so we are going to have a controller as well. So the one that I need for now is a repository package. So just quickly go ahead and create a repositories, right? A repositories package. So the controller, don't worry about it. We are going to look at it just shortly. So initially I need the repository package. So I've created a package called repository. So inside the repository package, just quickly go ahead and create a class called user repository, right? So for this class, it's going to be an interface. So just make sure that you select interface on your IntelliJ. So I've created an interface called user repository. So what this repository allows us to do is it actually allows us to actually go ahead and persist our data in terms of getting data, setting data, and stuff like that. So for you to be able to actually go ahead and access those JPA persistence methods that are provided with JPA, you need to actually go ahead and extend the JPA repository. So just quickly go ahead and extend your JPA repository. So I'm simply going to say extends here JPA repository like this. So once you have extended the JPA repository, it actually takes two arguments. So the first argument is the name of your model. So the name of our model is user, right? So the name of our model is user, and then the next parameter that it takes is the data type of the primary key. So remember, we created an ID as our primary key, and its data type was long. So once you have done that, you now once you have extended the JPA repository, it now allows you to actually go ahead and have all the data persistence methods that we need to persist our data. So in this case, we now have access to the save method, which actually go ahead and save data to your database, then the find all, find by ID, and so forth. So once you have done that, you are probably done with your JPA repository. So the next thing that we need to do is you now need to create your controllers. So I've already created a package name called controllers. So inside this package name, I'm going to create a class called user controller, right? So inside this user controller class, this is where you are probably going to have all the fun stuff. So by the fun stuff, I mean this is now going to be a blueprint for our API. This is where we are going to go ahead and tell Spring that this is going to be a REST controller. So the first thing that you need to annotate is you need to annotate your class with a REST controller. So what this annotation does is it actually tells Spring that, okay, this is going to the data that is going to be returned by each method that we're going to create, by each method that we're going to create in this class is going to have a response body, a JSON response body instead of a template. So this is where we begin to create our REST API by annotating with a REST controller. So once you've done that, the first thing that you need to do is you need to bring in your data persistence class. That is, in this case, you need to bring in your user repository. So I'm simply going to say user repository. Then I'm simply going to say user repository like this. So once you have brought in your user repository, the next thing that you need to do is you need to create a constructor for your user controller. So I'm simply going to create a non-default constructor, and then I'm simply going to say it's going to be public user controller, right? And this constructor is going to take the user repository, right? Like so. Then I need to actually go ahead and initialize our instance method. So I'm simply going to say this dot user repository is called user repository, right? So once you've done that, the next thing that you need to do is you need to auto-wire your class to allow automatic dependency injection. So you actually go ahead and annotate it with a auto-wired like this. This will actually let your controller be actually be automatically it actually automatically enables the automatic dependency injection, right? So once you have done this, it's now time for us to actually go ahead and define our endpoints for our REST API. So remember, like I said, this is going to be an a user registration API where we are going to perform our CRUD functionality for API. That is, we're going to write some create requests, some read, some update, and some delete requests. So this is where you need to actually go ahead and define your endpoints for your API. So the first endpoint that I'm going to define is I'm going to define an endpoint called save user. So let's quickly go ahead and create a function called save user. So I'm simply going to say public user. So it's going to return data of type user, right? Then the function name, I'm going to call it save user like this, right? So inside this function, this is where we're going to return the user once we hit the endpoint save user. So for you to actually go ahead and hit the endpoint, you need to actually go ahead and annotate it with post mapping. So remember, Spring it has these annotation helpers that allows us to define the specific request method type that you want to perform. So in this case, we want to perform a post request, right? So this post request, we want to perform it to an endpoint that we're going to call user /save. So whenever we hit user /save, this is the method that we want to actually go ahead and fire. So for you to actually define your post mapping method, you actually go ahead, your post request method, you actually go ahead and annotate your function with post mapping like this, right? So for our post requests, that is going to have this endpoint, or that is going to have this URL, like for example, localhost /8000/user/save. Whenever we hit this endpoint, this is the method that is going to be run. All right. So now to actually go ahead and save our user, the first thing that we need to do is we actually need to grab the user object that would have posted. So to grab the user object, you need to use the annotation code request body, right? So this request body allows you to actually go ahead and grab your user. So we are simply going to define a user object. So this is the user object that we're grabbing that is going to come from our post request. So once you have grabbed the user, the next thing that you need to do is to actually go ahead and save or to persist the user to your table or to that model that you defined with the table name called user. So to do that, you actually need to use your repository, right? So I'm simply going to say return this dot user repository dot save. So I'm simply going to say to save my user in my user table called user. So I'm simply saving the user object that we have grabbed from our post request into a table name called user. So remember, like I said, the user repository allows us to actually go ahead and have methods to the data persistence method that you need to do. So that's the beauty of Spring. You actually don't need to actually go ahead and redefine some of these methods to persist your data, like saving data, getting all data and stuff like that. You actually need to actually use your user repository. Since you have extended the JPA repository, it allows us to have functions to actually be able to call these methods that are defined in the JPA repository. So this is all what you need to actually go ahead and save your user. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to actually create an endpoint for getting all users. So I'm simply going to say public, right? And then I need to return a list of users. So to do that, I will use something called response entity, right? So what response entity does is it allows me to actually go ahead and define the data type of the data that I want to return. So in this case, I want to return a list, right? A list of data of type user, right? So once I've done that, let me actually go ahead and import list, right? So once I've done that, I need to call my method get users, like so, right? So once you've done this, we are simply telling Spring that I need to return a list of data of type user. So for you to actually define the endpoint for the get request that we're going to run, we need to annotate it with a mapping called get mapping. So what get mapping does is it actually allows you to have access to your get request whenever you have a get request to user slash or like what you've defined here. If it is a get request, this Spring actually know that okay, we need to match it with this mapping, then we're going to run whatever function is defined under this mapping. So the get users function will be fired, and what we want to return is we want to return a list of users. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to say return response entity, then the response entity is in a helper method called okay, like for example the response status of 200, right? Then I'm simply going to say this dot user repository dot, remember our user repository that we have extended the JPA, it allows us to have these helper functions, like for example the find all method. So simply what I'm simply doing is, if you're in SQL, this is simply like select all from users. So what I'm simply saying is user repository dot find all, the helper method that is found in the JPA. This is going to return a list of users. So once you've done this, you are probably done with your let me remove this semicolon, right? You're probably done with your get users request. So the next thing that we need to define is we want to actually go ahead and get a specific user. So what you want to do is, let me start by annotating, right? So what you want to do is I want to have a get request, right? So this get request, I'm going to hit the endpoint slash user, then I'm simply going to pass an ID. So what I want to do is I want to grab a specific user by a specific user by a specific ID, which I have passed on my get request, right? So this function it's going to return a user. So I'm simply going to say public, then I'm simply going to use response entity, then it's going to return a user. Then the function, I'm simply going to call it get user, right? That's the function name, right? So for get user, we need to define the functionality here. So for us to be able to grab the ID, because remember, we need to grab it by this ID. So for us to be able to grab this ID, there's an annotation helper that is called path variable, right? So the path variable allows us to actually go ahead and grab the value. So the value that we want to grab is code ID. So the next thing that you need to do is to actually go ahead and declare the ID. So the ID name is going to be of type long, and actually go ahead and grab it like so. So once you have grabbed your ID, right, the next thing that you need to do is actually need to go ahead and create my user. Then this user, I'm now going to use my user repository, right? So the user repository, so we want to say, we want to write as a query, select, let's say all from users, where user ID is equals to whatever this ID that we've passed. So to do that, the JPA allows us to have a helper function called find by ID, right? So this find by ID will actually go ahead and pass our ID, right? So once you've done that, this actually the find by ID is actually so let me say find by ID, right, and pass my ID. So the find by ID is actually an optional, so which means if it is an optional, we need to have a way to actually go ahead and catch the error. For example, let's say if we have passed this ID and this ID does not exist, we actually need a way of handling the error to say this user does not exist. So this also, since find by ID is an optional, you actually need to go ahead and catch or write your exception handling. So we're simply going to say or else throw, right? Then we need to provide our supplier here. So the supplier that I'm going to provide is my error handling supplier. So I'm going to call it resource, right? Resource not found exception, right? And then I'm simply going to pass a message to say user not found, right? User not found, like this. So once you have done that, so this is going to be a new instance, so I need to do it like so, right? So as you can probably see, we do not have this resource not found exception. So let's just quickly go ahead and create this class that is going to handle our error if a user is not found. So to do that, just quickly copy the class name, right? Resource not found. Then inside my project, I'm going to create a new package called exceptions, right? So inside this package called exceptions, this is where I'm going to put all my exceptions. So the reason why I like to put my code in packages or to package is to make the code easier to actually debug. Because remember, if you are working on a project, you might have multiple developers working on a single project. So you might need to structure your code so that it will be understandable by other developers. So let's just quickly go ahead and create a class called resource not found exception, right, inside our exceptions package, right? So once you have created this class, right, I need to have so since it's going to be a runtime exception, because remember we are going to run our class, then if the user is not found, it's going to throw an exception. So this is a runtime exception, right? So the first thing that we need to do is we need to extend the runtime exception class, right? So once you've extended the runtime exception class, it actually goes ahead and allows us to actually have the methods that are provided by the runtime exception class. So the first thing that we need to do for our class is we need to annotate it with response status, right? So that we actually pass a value to say if this whatever this class is going to handle what type of request. So what type of status request. For the status that we're going to handle, we are simply going to say HTTP status not accepted, but not, can I find not found? Yeah, like this. So I'm simply going to annotate my class with with a status called not found, like this. So once I've done that, the next thing that I need to do is remember, for my exception, I've passed a message. So we need a way to actually go ahead and output this message to our user. So the next thing that I need to do is I'm simply going to say public, right? I'm simply going to create a constructor called public resource not found exception. Then this constructor is going to take a message, right? It's going to take a message. Then it's simply going to access the to access the constructor, the non-default constructor of our runtime exception, and pass our message. So what we're simply doing is we're simply passing the message to the runtime exception or constructor, so that we actually go ahead and print the exception that we have pulled. So once you've done that, the next thing that you need to do is to actually go ahead and import this class, right? So I have imported the class, right? And I seem to be having an error. So where's the error coming from? Okay, I seem to be having an error. All right, so the error probably is we need to return, because remember we have said we want to return a response entity of type user. So we now want to return our user object, right? So we are saying, so simply what we are saying is, if we have run this query and the user is not found, can you actually go ahead, we are going to throw an exception, because this library is going to be used by another person. So we are saying whatever the user is using our library, we need to throw an exception to say user not found. So if there is no error, then we need to return the user. So we are simply going to say return response entity dot okay, like so, then dot body, not dot build, dot body. Then we simply go ahead and pass our user object. So it's going to simply go ahead and return our object if the user is found. So once you've done that, we have actually created our get user, right? So get user is different from get users. So get user we are getting by ID. So the next method that I actually need to have is, I actually need to remember, it's a CRUD functionality. So right now we have done the save, we have done the get, right? So we now need the update and the delete method. So for the update method, I'm simply going to create a class, a function called, it's going to return a user. So I'm simply going to call it update user, right? So to update a user, remember the first thing that we need to do is we need to pass our new user. So before I do that, let me quickly go ahead and annotate it with the update request mapping. So Spring has a mapping called put mapping. So this put, we're actually going to run a put request, right? A put request to the endpoint /user. Then we're also going to provide an ID. So what we need to do is, we are saying if users, for example, for our API, let's say users on our front-end application, they want to update their profile, right? So if they want to update their profile, the first thing that they need to do is they have to be a specific user. Or let's say if it's an admin want to update a specific user, they have to go to that user, right? So to access that user, we are going to distinguish, identify the user with the ID, right? Then the next thing that they need to do is to actually go ahead and update the user on their interface, and then sends a put request, right? They then goes ahead and post their data using the put request method. So which means we need a way to actually go ahead and grab the ID, like what we did before, and as well as grab the new user object of data that they would have passed on their put request method. So to do that, just quickly go ahead and annotate your function with request body. Then we're saying this is going to be of type user. Then we're simply going ahead and grab the new user. So this is the new user that they would have passed, right? Then the next thing that we need to do is we need to actually go ahead and grab the ID. So to grab the ID, I'm simply going to copy and paste, because this is the same. We're simply going to use the path variable to grab this ID and declare the ID that is going to be of type long, right? So once you've done that, the first thing that we need to do is we need to get the user. So I'm simply going to say user repository dot find by ID. The first thing is we need to find the user, right? We need to find the user, right? So if we have found the user, right, we need to actually go ahead and update the user data with the new user data that would have passed, right? So let's say the user is available, right? So let's simply go ahead and map through that object of the new user that would have been returned. So we're simply going to map, right, the stream of data that would have been given by this function find by ID. So we're simply going to map the new user. So we are going to have a lambda expression that is going to update the new user data. So this is the old, so this user is the old user that we have, right? So we simply want to set the old user data with the new user data that would have passed here. So to do that, you simply goes ahead and say user dot set, right? So we need to update all the data. So we need to update the surname, right? And we're going to update it by the new user object that we've passed, and we get the surname like this. Sorry, it's the name, right? Like so. So once you've done that, you need to update the rest of your data on this object. So let's simply go ahead and update the rest. So I'm simply going to say copy and paste. So the next thing that we need to update is we need to update the surname like so. Then we simply go ahead and say get surname like so. So the next thing that we need to update is the email, right? We need to set the email with the new email that we've passed. So get email. So the next thing is the username. So for the username, I'm setting the username with the new username that we have passed. So right now we are simply updating the data that we have. Then for the password on their profile, I'll simply update it with the new password that we have passed, right? So remember, the find by ID, it returns on optional like we did before. So we need a way to actually go ahead and catch our error here. But before we do that, if right now we have updated the user object with the new user detail that we have. So we need to persist that, right? So to persist that, just simply go ahead and say return this dot user repository dot save, right? Then we save the user object that would have updated with the new details like so. So once you've done that, you have found the user, you have updated the user. So if you do not found the user, right? So if the user is not available, what we need to do is we actually need to go ahead and create the user if the user is not available, right? So to create the user, so I'm going to say or else get, right? Then I'm going to pass my supplier through my lambda expression, right? So like I said, if the user is not available, right, what I want to do is to actually go ahead and create that user. So I'm simply going to say new user is equal to set, right, set ID. Sorry, we're going to say new user dot set, what am I doing? All right, set ID, right, with the ID that we've passed. We are now setting our primary key. Then we say return this dot user repository dot save. Then we pass our new user object like so. So we're simply saying if the user is not available, just quickly go ahead and save this user. So if the user is not available, we are now saving the what? The user like so. So once you've done that, I think for the most part we are done with our update user, right? So do I have a bug somewhere? All right, so it seems as if I have left a return statement, so I need to return all this. Right, so once you've done this, you are done with the update user method. So the last method that we probably need to create is the delete method. So I'm simply going to say public then repository, response entity. This time is not going to return anything, so I'll simply say response entity of type void. Then I'm going to say remove user. So right now I want to remove a specific user, right? So let me simply go ahead and grab my ID, because remember I want to pass an ID so that I can actually go ahead and remove a specific ID, right? So to do that for your delete requests, Spring has a helper annotation called delete mapping. So want to delete if a user hits an endpoint, if a user sends a delete request, right, to the endpoint user, then if they've passed the ID, just go ahead and run this function, remove user, right? So to remove the user, what I'm simply going to do is I need to first go ahead and grab the user. So I'll say user.user-repository.find by ID, right? Once I have found the user, then if the user, let's say if the user is not found, what I simply need to do is I need to provide my supplier, which is simply going to say new resource not found exception, and I can say user not found, like so, right? So if the user is not found, just simply go ahead and run the user not found exception. So right now I seem to be having a bug somewhere. So it's update user, right? I need to close this up, then I need to provide my ID, like so. All right, so once you've done that, the next thing that I need to do, if the user is available, just quickly go ahead and remove the user. So I'll say user repository dot delete then I'll pass the user, right? I'll pass the user that would have found by our select query here. So once I've done this, then I will say return, then response. We need a response entity dot okay, so type 200, then dot build, like so. So once I've done this, I have successfully deleted my user from my table, right? So if you have done this, guys, congratulations, you are here now. So what we now need to do is we now want to go ahead and configure your database. So to configure the database, what I'm simply going to do is you simply need to go to resources, right? You simply go to resources, then applications.properties. So inside the applications.properties, this is where we are going to configure our database. So remember, like I said before, we are using an H2 database. So this is the database that we probably need to configure. So the reason why we are using an H2 database is there are no extra configurations that we need to do to our system. Like for example, we do not need to actually go ahead and configure our system to have a database or something like that. So this is an in-memory database that is going to be used by Springboot, right? So if it's an in-memory database, it means there are no extra configurations that you need to do except for your application. So let me simply go ahead and paste what I have here. So what I'm simply saying is for the data URL, I'm simply going to say testdb. Then for the driver class name, I'm simply going to say h2 driver, right? Then for the username, it's SA. For the password, I'm going to leave it as blank. Then one also thing that you need to configure to note is I'm enabling my H2 console, so that if you want to view your database or your schema on a browser, you actually need to enable this to true. Then you need to actually define your path. So if you define your path like localhost /8000/H2, you actually have access to your schema. Then this I will leave it as is, right? So once you have done that, you are probably done with configuring your H2 database, right? So if you want to, so remember, and what the reason why, also the reason why I was choosing this is it's actually faster to run as well. So which means if you are running tests or something like that, it's actually easier to actually go ahead and run your tests using an H2 database, because it's fast. It easily creates or tear down your database in a fast way. So one thing that you have to note about the H2 database is this database is volatile. It's an in-memory database. So which means each and every time you run your application, right, your database will start, right? Then each and every time you close your application or you close your terminal to your application, your database will automatically tear down. So that's one thing that you need to note here. This so it's not recommended to actually use this for production or for developing if you are continuously persisting data to your database and want to continuously test your data, because your data will be lost after you have restarted your application. So just quickly go ahead and configure these configurations. So once you've done that, the next thing that we now need to do is we now want to test our API. So to test our API, I'm going to test it with JPA unit testing, right? I'm not going to use Postman or anything like that. I need to use JPA so that you can actually go ahead and learn how you can write your unit testing for a repository. So just stay tuned and see you in the next one.